knowing when it is deeply ignorant, those who are not among the few who are knowingly manipulating events. They are awash with ignorance, with mendacity, and with the arrogance that they know best, and therefore the will of the people doesn't really matter. Unless, of course, it corresponds with what they think is what should be done, and then, they're all for democracy then. The British Prime Minister, Theresa May, at least in the words she spoke, was committed to triggering Article 50 early next year. Brexit means Brexit, she said. The will of the people must be followed, adhered to, respected. But this week, there was a legal challenge in the High Court in London, led by a millionaire City of London fund manager called Gina Miller, and a few others I'll come to block the triggering by the government of Article 50 without a vote in Parliament. And of course, what Ms. Miller said, that she was doing this to protect parliamentary democracy. Yeah, okay. That actually is not what it's about. You see, there's a majority in the Houses of Parliament that does not want Britain to leave the EU. So by taking it back there and having the members of Parliament and unelected House of Lords decide what will and will not happen with regard to Brexit, despite 17.4 million people voting to come out and the majority in the referendum. That means that we are now in a situation, unless the government wins its appeal, where a majority of members of Parliament who want to stay in the EU now have enormous control over where Brexit goes from here. They can block it, they can delay it, they can water it down to the point where it's not Brexit at all, but just membership of the European Union under another name. And ideally, what they want to do is to bring about another second referendum. This is what happens when you go against the EU in a referendum. You've seen it all over Europe. They then have another referendum and they overturn the result of the first referendum, which they didn't like. And so now the will of the people in the referendum is now being usurped by Parliament and members of Parliament. And it is a situation that is frankly outrageous, disgusting, despicable, but in some ways a positive thing, because it is showing people in their face that the financial and political class couldn't give a damn about what they want. Because this country, like every other country, is not run for the people. It's run for the political and financial classes, and like I keep saying, the hidden hand networks that work through those classes. So we're asked to believe by this Gina Miller, who is a city fund manager and married to a city slicker who's even got a well-known nickname in the city as Mr. Hedge Fund. and they apparently run an investment operation, which, according to reports, has portfolios worth around £100 million. So they're regular people, just like the rest of us. And she asks us to believe that this legal challenge to the government's right to trigger Brexit without a parliamentary vote is about process. It's not about politics. It's about politics, Gina, isn't it? And you know it. Here we have a lady who says that she was so horrified by the Brexit vote that it made her, quote, physically sick. So here we're being asked to believe that someone so vehemently in favour of staying in the EU has simply thrown this spanner in the works of the Brexit process, simply because she believes in parliamentary democracy and she wants to protect it. That, Gina, would be the parliamentary democracy that your fantastic, what could be wrong with it, EU has spent the last more than 40 years destroying, with more and more laws being made by dark suit bureaucrats outside of this country, never mind outside of Parliament. This is the EU that is a bureaucratic tyranny, taking away and deleting year on year on year the right of sovereign parliaments to make decisions about what happens in their country. But you, a supporter of the European Union in the extreme, and all that, I've only done this to throw the Brexit process into turmoil because you believe in parliamentary democracy. They really do think we're all frickin' idiots. But as they found in the referendum, we ain't. This is a quote from Gina Miller, who was only doing it to protect the process. I felt physically sick, she said, when the referendum result came through, because I thought, I don't think people know the ramifications of this, of what's happened, and I felt really sorry that people had been tricked and fooled. You see, the financial and political classes, they know best, you see. So if you are just an ordinary person, just one of the great unwashed, then you really don't know anything about anything. You haven't worked out that Britain has lost control of its own country to the European Union. You haven't worked out all the European laws and regulations that are dictating, like I say, the fine detail of your life and what you can do and can't do. You haven't worked out that smaller companies are being crushed by the weight of EU regulation that's destroying their ability to function. You can't work that out. You have to leave it to those who know best, the city financiers and the politicians. You're just the man in the street, the woman in the street. What do you know? She goes on. We must not underestimate or forget the anger in Europe. Ooh, really, I'm terrified. About our vote. They're very angry that we've had this relationship, yet we still threaten the union. Well, they should be angry then. Actually, there's a vast number of people in other European countries that want to do the same that Britain did. and vote to come out. They're not being given the chance because the political class that knows best is terrified that they might do the same. It's extraordinary. Now, let's have a look at these other people who were behind this legal challenge, in which judges decided that it had to go to Parliament for a vote before Article 50 could be triggered and could not just be done by the government carrying out the will of the people. The organisation behind this, or one of them, is called People's Challenge. Who are these people? It was set up in the summer by a guy called Graham Pigney, a British expatriate. He now lives in France. And Paul Cartwright, who is a Gibraltar national and works as an environmental officer for the Gibraltar government. Was Gibraltar in England or Scotland or Wales, Northern Ireland, the last time you alive? I don't believe it was. Mr. Pigney, originally from Fareham in Hampshire, is a semi-retired man and has lived in a wine-growing region of Carcassonne for 19 years. So one of the people behind this doesn't even live in the country and has lived in France for 19 years. And he wants to, in effect, let's be very open and sensible about it. He wants to block Brexit. That's what this is really all about. No, it's the process. Anyway, also backing this legal action that won this ruling this week is an organisation called Fair Deal for Expats Group. Well, expats. So they don't live in England either, or Britain. No. It includes among them dozens of Britons living abroad. Oh, anyone notice a theme here? And these include a British company director who lives in France, seems to be a popular place, a businessman who runs holiday rentals in Italy, and an English language teacher in Hamburg, Germany. I never saw Britain get a mention there. Mr. Pigney defended his decision to launch People's Challenge. He said, I happen to live in France, but that is inconsequential in the context of the constitutional crisis we are facing. The constitutional crisis that your challenge has just massively added to, by the way. And it's not inconsequential. He says here, what's at stake is nothing less than parliamentary sovereignty. We need to make sure we do not hand the sovereignty of the UK to a self-appointed government. Well, what do you mean the sovereignty that's being handed to in effect, self-appointed bureaucrats for the last 40-odd years? And of course, it's not inconsequential that someone who starts a legal challenge affecting the vote of 17.4 million people actually has lived in another country for 19 years. Another guy in this group is a Brazilian-born hairdresser who no one seems to know much about. And that is the organisation with their 12 barristers, obviously money no object there, who have created a situation where the anti-EU majority, or the anti-leave the EU majority in Parliament, now potentially, unless this government appeal is successful, now have enormous control over the Brexit process, how fast it moves, the nature of what it is, etc. And that's the whole point of what has happened here. And the judgment was made by 3 judges, including one, the Lord Chief Justice, who actually is a co-founder of an organisation dedicated to integrating laws all over Europe into one EU group of laws that are basically all the same. In other words, centralizing control in Europe via the legal system. And, you know, in the last 24 hours, day or two, since this judgment was made, we have seen so many extraordinarily ludicrous things said, like it's just about the process, not politics. And another one is, I saw that the judgment was made by an independent judiciary, acting above politics and outside politics. You know the greatest threat to humankind. It's frickin' naivety. The idea that the judiciary is above politics and the judiciary is independent is absolutely ludicrous. Like I say, what it's really about is blocking Brexit, or watering it down to the point where it ain't Brexit at all. And that's beyond all the bullshit. That's exactly what this is about. And it's sickening to me, anyway, to see this group who call themselves progressives, word that came out of America, basically those of the left and Greens and all these people call themselves liberals, to see them lining up alongside and cheering when they came out of the High Court, the city millionaires, and lining up alongside the financial and political class in demanding, in effect, that the will of the people is not adhered to and we stay in the EU. Here we have these so-called, because that's what they are, so-called progressives, who will go on marches and protest against the extremes of the financial class and the political class that they don't agree with, or that part of the political class they don't agree with, while they now stand alongside of them to defend democracy by destroying it. They stand alongside people like Tony Blair, a man who so loves parliamentary democracy that he lied to Parliament to justify a catastrophic war that has cost the lives of millions of people, both in Iraq and as a result of what that invasion of Iraq has done since in terms of the Middle East. A man who didn't even keep his own cabinet informed of what was going on in relation to the invasion of Iraq. These progressives, the British equivalent of the bullshitter in the United States, a classic fake progressive Michael Moore, are now standing shoulder to shoulder with people like Tony Blair. It is absolutely pathetic. And we're seeing, we are in a point now where things are coming to the surface where we can't ignore them anymore. This is why you've got that quote from the Daily Mail using the word conspiracy of the political class against the people. It's becoming blatant. Look at the Clinton emails, how they've shown the collusion with the media, how they collude to block the candidates like Bernie Sanders that they don't want. How behind the scenes they're saying exactly the opposite to what they're saying in public. And how the whole system is so deeply, shockingly, unspeakably corrupt. And now we're having this put in our face again in Britain, the political class and that which was behind the political class, which, like I say, most of the political class doesn't even know that hidden hand exists. While it does its bidding, just like the progressives, global warming, political correctness, stay in the EU, these are all desires of the hidden hand, which the progressives play out, thinking they're being progressive. It's hilarious, if he wants, tragic. You know, we've reached the point now where we, the people, have got to say enough. We've got to stop cooperating with this system of corrupt, mendacious control and stop handing our power to it. They have the power to dictate our lives because we give that power to them. How can their number dictate to millions of people, globally billions of people? They can't unless those millions and billions give their power away to them. We've got to stop it because it's becoming more blatant and therefore more obvious because it's becoming more extreme. And the naivety of people, like I say, is extraordinary, as we're seeing this week. I saw this post. It's just an example of endless ones on social media just after this judgment was made, from a guy called Martin Cuff, whoever he is. One day we'll thank Gina Miller for saving the entire notion of British parliamentary democracy, he says. The British parliamentary democracy and sovereignty that has been systematically destroyed by the EU, which this lady clearly is desperate for us to stay in. And just before this vote, I read this story. It's about a guy called David Attenborough, famous filmmaker on nature. And he's part of the BBC establishment, which is very pro-EU, which is part of the political establishment, the financial establishment. They're just dumb masks on the same face. And this is what the story said. David Attenborough risked enraging millions by claiming the public is not wise enough to have been given a say on Brexit. Note that theme. The public is not wise enough. We're the political classes. Only we know what's best. Could have been Gina Miller. The TV naturalist said the vote from 17.4 million British citizens to leave the EU had created a mess. Actually, it wasn't. But it's more of one now, thanks to the political class. And argued that the decision should have been left to MPs to vote on our behalf. Oh, David. I must send him the link to Naivety Anonymous. These were the people that voted to have a war in Iraq. These are the people that have made catastrophic decisions in relation to giving power away to the EU, that have made catastrophic decisions right across the board that have damaged life in Britain. Critics accuse the 90-year-old of being elitist. No, never, surely. And failing to recognise what the people want. But that doesn't matter. You're the great unwashed. You just do what we say. Pat you on the head when you agree with us. Smack you on the head when you don't. Referring to Donald Trump's rise in the US, Sir David said, "There's confusion, isn't there?" Well, I suspect that David Attenborough is rather often confused myself. There's confusion, isn't there, between populism and parliamentary democracy. I mean, that's why we're in the mess we are with Brexit, is it not? No. Do we really want to live by this kind of referendum? When it's fundamental to people's lives, yes. And he added, what we mean by parliamentary democracy is surely that we find someone we respect. Well, that's going to be bloody hard when it comes to MPs, isn't it? That we find someone that we respect, that we think is probably wiser than we are. Well, that's even more difficult. What's the man talking about? But this is the mindset of the political, financial, and media establishment. We think is probably wiser than we are, who is prepared to take the responsibility of pondering difficult things and then trust him or her to vote on our behalf. And a few people can't control the world. It's a piece of cake. The war on terror is a war on freedom. I've been saying that, writing that for years and years and years, and so have many others in the alternative media. And the horrific events of the last week and more in Tunisia, in France, and parts of the Arabic world are simply the next step to advance the agenda of destroying human freedom and much else besides. And this is not some conspiracy theory pulled out of the ether. It's in documents that you can read and see the connections between. You can go back, for instance, to a document known as a clean break, which was produced for Benjamin Netanyahu in the 1990s by the infamous neocons in the United States, people like Richard Pearl and others. And what it proposed in terms of what Israel should do is mirrored by current events in terms of the countries they should target: Syria, Iraq, Iran, and countries they should try to go into an alliance with in achieving the end of targeting those countries. You can bring it a few years forward to the year 2000, when the same neocons in the United States that were the force behind the Bush administration, they produced a document through a front operation called the Project for the New American Century, calling on the United States to fight multi-theater wars against the same names: Syria, Iraq, Libya, and others, Iran. And just after that, in 2001, in fact, 1 year after that to the month, we had 9/11, the official story of which is shockingly ridiculous and quite obviously a cover story. In the Project for the New American Century document, it said that a new Pearl Harbor would be required to justify these multi-theater wars against these countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And a year later, after this crowd behind that document came to power with the Bush administration, we had 9/11 with its ridiculous official fairy tale. And what has happened as a result of that? The countries targeted in both a clean break and the Project for the New American Century document have been bombed, turned into chaos, and in terms of Iran, constantly threatened and undermined. Then you can go just a very short time, matter of days and weeks after 9/11, and you pick up the story told by General Wesley Clark, a supreme commander for NATO at one point, who said that he went to the Pentagon immediately after 9/11 and was told by a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the plan was, so this man had been told from on high, in other words, the Secretary of Defense's office, Donald Rumsfeld, that they were going to target and regime change a series of countries in the next few years that followed that. And what were those names? Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran. The story just is so blatant. And so, to achieve that, they had to find excuses for public consumption only to pick off those countries. So, of course, they went into Afghanistan, first of all, on the basis that bin Laden orchestrated 9/11 from some cave in Afghanistan, and so we must get rid of the Taliban, and we must invade Afghanistan. And then, of course, we had the weapons of mass destruction big lie from Bush and Blair to justify the invasion of Iraq. Tick, from these documents. We had the extraordinary in the sense of it being so blatant, removal of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya on the basis of he's killing his own people, when the people that he was in conflict with were trained, armed and funded mercenaries, most of them, funded, armed and trained by the West. So you create a situation where you create the problem by doing what I've just said in relation to these rebels, and then you offer the solution, which is removing Gaddafi because he's killing his own people when he's just fighting these Western trained, armed and funded rebels. And then, having ticked that off your list, Gaddafi's gone, you then go on to Syria. And Syria, in terms of the rebels and the people that are behind all that, were largely shipped over from Libya when they'd done the job there. And so you had the attempt to overthrow Assad as quickly as they did Gaddafi. But Assad refuses to budge to this day, as a result of which they have to keep finding excuses to remove him and to help the rebels they control and dictate to remove him. And so there has been an effort to justify Western bombing of Syria. Of course, Obama and the British Prime Minister Cameron tried to do that a few years ago, and they couldn't get it agreed to. Certainly Cameron couldn't in the Houses of Parliament. And that was an attempt to justify the bombing of Syria on the basis that Assad had used chemical weapons against his own people. It's kind of a mirror of the technique of Gaddafi and that a whole Libyan operation, but it was classic problem, reaction, solution, or in this case, no problem, reaction, solution, because the evidence points to the fact that it was actually members of this rebel group that actually use the chemical weapons. So Assad won't go, and they couldn't justify bombing Syria as a result of this attempted con trick over chemical weapons. And then ISIS starts to emerge. ISIS being an outgrowth of the whole terrorist movement in the Middle East that really got underway after 9/11, going before, but started to really become more and more prominent after 9/11, with Al-Qaeda and all that, which the evidence shows very clearly was a creation of the Washington administrations. So what do we do now? We need to tick off this latest country on our list, Syria, but he won't go. So we have to do something to get rid of him. And what they want to do, quite clearly, is start bombing Syria. So after this latest series of horrific atrocities, especially from a Western point of view, the killing of nearly 40 people on the beach in Tunisia, we had this announcement this week from the Defense Secretary of Britain. Consider Syria ISIS strikes, Defense Secretary urges MPs. The Defense Secretary has paved the way for airstrikes on Islamic State targets in Syria, saying the extremists needed to be targeted at source. This Defense Secretary is a bloke called Michael Fallon. And the opposition party in Britain, Labour, has indicated it would not oppose military action in Syria as it did in 2013. That's when they tried to do the chemical weapons scam. The party's acting leader, Harriet Harman, said Islamic State had to be stopped and Labour would look very seriously at any proposals brought forward by the government. She said the situation was different from that in 2013, when Labour voted against airstrikes in Syria because IS was a terrorist organisation, while President Assad was the head of a government, albeit a terrible regime. A bit like our own then. And so what's happened here is, instead of directly bombing Syria on the basis of get rid of Assad because of chemical weapons, they've just changed the argument slightly to get support and justification by saying, actually, no, we don't want to bomb Assad, we want to bomb ISIS in Syria, right? Yeah, in Syria, yeah. And of course, the politicians who most of them are not manipulating. Some of them are people in the know, the people who are the designated front men and women for all this. Most of them are just clueless about the world they're actually living in and what's going on all around them. It's extraordinary how high you can go in the political pyramids and the system pyramids until you find someone that actually is in the know of exactly what's going on, or at least some of what's going on. Prime Minister David Cameron later said that ISIS posed an existential threat to the West, and its members in Iraq and Syria were plotting terrible attacks on British soil. And that's another aspect of this whole war on terror, and an aspect, very large aspect, of what happened in Tunisia. And that is to use these appalling attacks to justify more and more deletion of basic freedoms at home, to protect people from the terrorists. It's so simple, and people in such large numbers still can't bloody see it. You create terrorist groups to do terror with this arm or this hand, and then through this hand you use governments and military to respond to the terror. and in doing so, take away freedoms at home and justify wars in faraway lands. Behind me is the Amari Air Base, which is very relevant in this time because it's a NATO base in Estonia. Estonia, of course, bordering Russia, and we have this Operation Atlantic Resolve, where the propaganda against Russia and how Russia is going to invade border countries has led to this build-up, the justification of this build-up of NATO resources and the NATO military operation in these border countries like Estonia. And the demonization of Russia has become so insanely ludicrous and so blatant in the sense of what it's trying to achieve. If you can make people fearful of something, whatever it is, in this case fear of Russia, then they will not protest and even support the fact that you will take action to protect them from what you've manipulated them to fear. And so everything now is the Russians. We've got a situation where in the United States we have the emails that were leaked, which were of course devastating to the campaign of Hillary Clinton, and that was blamed on the Russians. The Russians are interfering with, as these military vehicles go past, the Russians were interfering with the American election, when in fact the evidence produced was zilch. And then people say that, okay, we have all these American agencies that are saying the same, like the FBI and so on. They're saying the same, that it was the Russians that was involved in it. But then you say, well, hold on a minute. These agencies were all controlled by the same people, and therefore they're all singing from the same script, the same propaganda script that is trying to sell the line about Russia. And of course it's going on in Europe. It's going on in terms of the demonization of Russia in these border countries and the rest of Europe, but particularly here, to the point where this Operation Atlantic Resolve has kicked in. And talking to people in Estonia and talking to people about their friends' reaction to all this, it's very clear that there are large numbers of people who have actually bought this idea of the Russian threat, when in fact you look at the history of NATO since the Second World War, and what you have is NATO is the threat to peace. What is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is supposed to protect this area of the world? What is it doing bombing civilians in Libya? What is it doing through its constituent parts being involved in these wider conflicts in the Middle East? NATO is not there to protect people from the Russian threat. It's there as a war machine to impose the will of the hidden hand which controls it. People like NATO, organizations like NATO, the EU and what have you, they're all in the end controlled by the same people. And we've been talking on the streets of Tallinn, the Estonian capital, to people to see their reaction to what's going on and their reaction to the propaganda about Russia and the attempts to make them fear and thus accept an ever greater NATO presence in this part of the world.
Can I get your opinion on the sort of impending threat of Russia to the Estonian community?
It's hard to say where it's going at the moment, because in Estonia we have a few political parties that are Russian-minded, and also the things going in the USA. I think that the threat is never going to go away, and it's going to stay, but when Russia's going to make a move on Estonia, we don't know.
This huge amount of propaganda poured into the heads of our people on the daily and nightly basis. It's been successful, and people, they know that aggressor and the invader is on the east side of our border. And nobody even cares about that. And if you ask the common people, they don't care, because they have a lot of difficulties to face them in everyday life. So it's just, I don't think it's serious.
In the West, particularly in America and Britain, there's a massive propaganda and demonisation of Russia, basically trying to fear people into the fact there's an attack imminent. Is there that feeling here in Estonia?
We've always had that feeling, but since we got free from Russia 25 years ago, then since that time everybody's always talking that there's a big threat, but actually we haven't seen any big moves from their side, so I think people are calming down, because nothing actually has happened in like the past 25 years. So many big things.
Well, actually, so far we've been dealing only with propaganda, which makes the world only black and white, and basically wanting to, let's say, 90 even more percent, the propaganda has been telling us that Putin is about to invade Estonia any minute, and we should be prepared for that, and especially we should be depending on our NATO allies. And, well, I don't think, personally, I don't think that it's the right approach, and there are no signs, documented signs, that Putin is preparing an invasion to anywhere. Because if people are telling about Ukraine, there's been no invasion, and even in NATO, great leaders, big leaders, a la Fuzov and others, admirals, they've been telling that in Ukraine, let's say, the legal government is not facing and fighting against Russian federal troops. There are some volunteers from all over the world there, but and the same is here. So far we've been hearing only what it is, let's say, propaganda, and no analysis whatsoever.
How strong is the propaganda on the media here, trying to scare people into the fact that big bad Russia are going to come and invade again?
I think it's very strong, because I think who listen every day mainstream media, they are scared.
Well, in the West, in Britain and America, we've had a lot of propaganda against Russia, and Putin in particular, trying to paint him as a modern-day Stalin. What's been the response to the propaganda here in Estonia? Are people scared? Are people actually buying the propaganda against Russia?
I think people are buying the propaganda very much. Estonian people is saying in Estonia, if it's written on newspaper, it must be true.
So there are some views of Estonians on how they see the current situation with regard to the NATO build-up in their country, and indeed other countries bordering Russia. And just come a mile down the road from that NATO airbase, and here is a cemetery, a military cemetery from the time of the Soviet Union, which of course occupied Estonia. And it brings it home. Just a mile apart, you've got those that are engaging in war, and those who came to an end as a result of military actions. And we have allowed the world to be taken over by the most extreme psychopathic mind. And when you see the number of people who have been killed and maimed, both military and civilians, decade after decade after decade. This world has been constantly at war. You look at the history of wars involving the United States alone since 1776. It's absolutely shocking. So, why is it happening? Why, here again, are we building up and pushing towards another conflict, this time with Russia, which of course will bring China in as well? Why is that mayhem and death and destruction happening day after day in the Middle East, year after year after year? Because the psychopathic, insane people that we have allowed to take this world over are deciding that that is how it's going to be. And had Hillary Clinton been elected as President of the United States, this war with Russia would have definitely kicked off. It might still do so with Donald Trump. And I hope that the conciliatory things that he said with regard to conflict in Russia are followed through. But with Donald Trump, he reverses what he says and what he thinks so often, then we've got to wait and see, not take his word for it. And it's not encouraging when you've got Trump in his election campaign talking about a massive increase in the United States military. It's also already rather vastly in proportion greater than something like 7 other countries combined, including China and Russia. I mean, how much military does the United States want? But of course, it's not the United States military. It's the military of the hidden hand. And all this money, this extraordinary level of spending while Americans sleeping the streets, that is spent on the military, is not for the benefit of the United States. It's for the benefit of that works through the United States, that works through its presidents, that works through its military and its Pentagon. And these are the people we've given the world away to, and we need to take it back. So, is it really too much of an ask that instead of demonizing Russia, that those in power sit down and come to an agreement with Russia, come to a situation, for instance, where Russia and the countries of Europe and the United States combine together to sort out the United States, UK-created terrorists in the Middle East and bring that horror to an end. If they were reasonable people who generally wanted to bring it to an end, that would have happened already. But they're not. Putin seems very accommodating and intellectually is far more intelligent than the Western world leaders combined. I'm not saying that he's God's gift to humanity and, you know, he runs tea parties for kids. He's obviously a ruthless man, or he wouldn't have been running Russia for so long. But neither, although the propaganda would like us to believe it, neither is he Stalin. Neither is Russia now the old Soviet Union. And the offer is there for the West to come to an accommodation with Russia so we can all get on with our lives. I hope Trump, like I say, follows through with what he's saying, and that happens. But in the background, the hidden hand won't want it to happen, because the hidden hand wants World War III, because that's been planned all along. 3 world wars to transform the nature of human society. The first 2 world wars transformed the nature of human society. Look what happened. And they want to complete the job with World War III. That was always the plan. And this is what this demonization of Russia is all about. So we, as the people, the human race, billions of us, who face the consequences of what these insane people in the shadows are doing, need to understand how the game's played and no longer to accommodate it, no longer play a part in it, no longer meekly walk along saying, yes sir, no sir, they must know what they're doing. They don't. Except that they do know that they're seeking to bring about yet another world conflict. So we need to get informed about what's really happening, because these events are not random. What's happening down the road from here with the NATO build-up in Estonia is not random. It's part of a long-term plan to bring about yet another horrific global war. And we, this time, need to say it's not going to happen, and we're not going to give our support to it, and we're not going to allow the politicians and the military to any longer be the vehicle of this hidden hand and do its bidding, because we're not having it. I mean, how many more graves is it going to take before the world and its people take power back over their own society and stop these mad men and women devastating it year after year after year? Left alone, the vast majority of people in this world could live together. But with the hidden hand constantly manipulating, divide and rule, playing one part of society off against another, playing one race off against another, playing one religion off against another, has created a situation where it seems that we can't live together. But left to our own devices, we could, if that hidden hand and its public agents, if you like, were no longer allowed to do what they've done generation after generation after generation. We need to be the people that bring it to an end by no longer buying the propaganda, by seeing through it, and by saying we are not having it anymore. Now, there are many nice people in Britain with decent values of fairness, of justice. But the British establishment that runs the place and ran the great British Empire wouldn't know of value if one bit them on the arse. And Rhodes was a great symbol of this plundering, this acquisition of much of the world for the benefit, not in the end of Britain, but of those that controlled Britain and still do. So I understand why students can see a Rhodes statue as a symbol of all that. But, you know, people can get so focused on the twigs that they can't see the forest. And the biggest form of colonialism is colonizing the mind. And if the same focus and outrage was set upon what is happening in terms of education in all its forms, being little more than a programming operation to download the official version of everything. And if they looked with the same vehemence as they do at a Rhodes statue at the way this programming is becoming more and more blatant, then we might have a chance of protecting what's left of freedom, freedom of choice, and freedom of expression. Never mind a statue. What's happening all the time and what is gathering pace all the time? This is a definition of colonialism. The policy or practice of a wealthy or powerful nation's maintaining or extending its control over other countries, especially in establishing settlements or exploiting resources. Fair enough, everybody will recognize that as a definition of colonialism. But here's another. The system or policy by which a nation seeks to extend or retain its authority over other peoples or territories. And the territory that I'm talking about is the human mind. It's the focus of everything in terms of authority and the establishment, because if you are the few and you want to control the many, you can't do it physically. You can in small areas, you can in some ways, but overall you can't. To control the vast majority, you have to control the way they think and the way they perceive both themselves and the world around them, so that they will accept things that suit your agenda. And a teacher sent me this week. It's it's kind of a document. It's gone out from government to schools and teachers, and it's called Extremism, Radicalisation, here we go, British Values. And these British values are defined in this thing as democracy. That means David Cameron's current government getting almost total power from 37% of the vote. The rule of law. The rule of law is that people you have no control over make law and then you obey it, no matter how ludicrous or freedom-destroying it is. Individual liberty, that's a British value. It's being deleted by the day. They don't recognise individual liberty, they want an end to it. This should be extremism, radicalisation, British values, brackets, bullshit. This has gone out to teachers, apparently. Another British value, mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. That obviously includes bombing people with brown faces all over the bloody world. Okay, so as a school, we help pupils instill these values through our curriculum and teaching, dictated by the state, through how we operate our school, dictated by the state, our attitudes and actions, dictated by the state, or you'll soon lose your job, darling. What we do and how we do it, dictated by the state. Everything that we offer, dictated by the state. But what this is about is finding and sifting out possible radicalisation. Dangerous people. And this is some behaviour to watch according to this thing. Some factors can indicate that a young person, stroke child, may be vulnerable to radicalisation, and these include a view that their religion or culture is under threat and unfairly treated. Well, What if it is? What if it's a genuine feeling? A tendency, this is the big one, a tendency to look for conspiracy theories and distrust of the media. So, if you are awake enough and bright enough and deprogrammed enough to realize that governments lie and manipulate and engineer events that suit them, or rather, more than that, the hidden hand that controls them and works through them, then you are a possible threat because you are becoming radicalized. And if you do not trust a mainstream media with an entire history of lies, manipulation, bias, then you are possibly a danger because you are becoming radicalized. Now, like all of these things, there is a apparent reason for it, and then there's the real reason for it. Same with laws. The apparent reason for this is preventing radicalization of Islamic nature, i.e. use the fear of ISIS to justify this stuff. So people say, yeah, we've got to stop the kids getting radicalized and going off to Syria. Well, if the British and the Americans and the French hadn't gone off to Syria, dropping bombs in all directions, then maybe Syria will be a different place today. But people see it from that point of view. So not everybody, more and more and more people are waking up, but most people still see it from that point of view. Yeah, we've got to stop radicalization, but that's not what it's about. It's about stopping anything, any questioning, any realization, any view that is bad for the state, exposes the state, questions the state. That's what it's really all about. And all this Islamic radicalization to justify this stuff is all flannel and all front. Other behavior to watch in case kids are becoming radicalized is the need for identity and belonging. Oh, that's terrible, that, isn't it? The need for a sense of self and belonging. Oh dear, arrest them. The need for more excitement and adventure. Behavior to watch. Behavior to encourage. Easily susceptible to influence by others. They must be talking about teachers and head teachers being easily susceptible to influence by whatever the state tells them to do and think and teach. Other changes may include being more argumentative. Oh, don't stand your corner. Accept it. Bow. Acquiesce. Using terms them and us when referring to religion and culture. It's what governments do all the time. Do you think they refer to Gaddafi in Libya as an us? Or Assad in Syria as an us? It's them and us, British values, them, threatening British values. Spending, I love this one, spending increasing amounts of time online and being secretive. Well, that kind of mops up and sucks in virtually every bloody teenager. Vast numbers of them anyway. I wish they didn't spend increasing amount of time online and doing that. But they do. The idea that is radicalization. And these things are part of a process of squeezing and squeezing and squeezing more and more and more what people in general, but in this case, young people, can say, do, think, express before the state jumps in and labels it unacceptable. It's about suppression of freedom. That's what it's about, in every sense. Anyway, I found this on the internet, and it's from a school. I won't say what it is because it's just an example. It's not a one-off. It's a primary and nursery school, and it's headed British Values and the Prevention of Radicalisation. As if British values and the prevention of radicalisation stroke extremism are kind of opposite sides of the fence. You see, we've reached a point now where the Orwellian inversion has reached such an extreme that you vote for war, you vote for bombing, again, people with brown faces, and you are a moderate MP. You vote against bombing people overwhelmingly with brown faces, and you are a extremist MP. You are a radical MP. You're someone to fear. It's all a bloody mind game, and that's why education is so prime to this whole agenda of human control, downloading perception from the earliest ages, and why I would suggest looking at this, students of Oxford and elsewhere, is rather more relevant than some statue of some appalling excuse for a human being. So anyway, let's go through this. This is just a primary and nursery school, but it's what's happening. Starts off, the Department of Education have recently reinforced the need to, quote, create and enforce a clear and rigorous expectation on all schools to promote the fundamental British values of democracy. 37% gives you total power. The rule of law. We make the law, you obey the law. Whatever it is. Individual liberty and mutual respect and tolerance. Well, where's the tolerance there for someone having a different view and having the intelligence to see that there are conspiracies going on and to see that the mainstream media is not actually the whole foundation of truth and integrity? What it means is the liberty and mutual respect and tolerance, so long as you say what's acceptable to the state. The government set out its definition of British values in the 2011 Prevent strategy. And these values have been reiterated by the Prime Minister this year. Well, what are the views of a Prime Minister doing in a document going out in a primary and nursery school? It's like journalism. It's like anything that is of a communication area, that they should be above government and what government says. Because how can you have free communication of information, be it in education or in the media, if what the Prime Minister, the government says, is going to dictate how you do it and what you say and what you communicate? Here, says the document, democracy is taken very seriously. Well, that's a bloody first. Children are actively encouraged to have a voice and share their views and opinions regularly, so long as they conform to opinions that are acceptable to that document. Every September we have an election week when the candidates for class representatives on school council pitch their election manifesto for the rest of their class. Yeah, what they do is prepare them to accept this ludicrous abuse of freedom called democracy. All children also complete an annual questionnaire which provides them with the opportunity to share their views of learning and suggest ways in which the school could be improved further. And unless it conforms to what the government says should happen at that school, then it's straight in the bin. Or, hey, Johnny could be going through radicalisation. The rule of law. The importance of laws, whether they be those that govern the class, the school, or the country, are consistently reinforced throughout the school day. Don't start me now. As well as when dealing with behaviour and through school assemblies. What schools are there for is not to bring out the true potential, the true uniqueness of children and young people. It's there to program a version of reality and to turn people into acquiescent slaves who will obey laws no matter what those laws are. So you come out of the womb and in 3-4 years, you're in a classroom and authority is telling you what to think, what's right, what's wrong, when you can go to the toilet, when you have to be there, when you can leave, and all that happens in between. And to do that, they have laws called rules, and they enforce them. And that's preparing young people to have a complete adult life doing the same in terms of the rules and regulations of the state created by people in parliaments and in truth in the shadows through parliaments and through governments, which the people have no say in what those laws will or will not be. Children are taught the value, this school says, and reasons behind laws. All that I've just said. That they govern and protect us. They govern and protect us. In other words, they dictate to us and claim to protect us, most of them. The responsibilities that this involves and the consequences when laws are broken are also explained. You mustn't break laws, mustn't break rules. Teacher never does. Dead, be out of a job. Our schools' rules, rewards and sanctions, which are displayed in all classrooms, referred to regularly and consistently, uphold a practical example of this. Visits from authorities such as the police help to reinforce the message. I bet they do. Our school rules, rewards and sanctions. Follow the rules, you'll be fine. You may even get a bit of benefit. Challenge the rules because you don't agree with them. Bad move. And that is the message from the earliest age that the system wants kids to take through the rest of their lives. Now, individual liberty. Would it be nice if we had some? That'd be lovely. Within school, children are actively encouraged to make decisions and choices. Now, here we go. Decisions and choices. Now, this is one of the great scams, freedom of choice. Now, if I put a cake on the table and an apple on the table, and I say, you've got a free choice, people might think, well, yeah, I've got freedom. I can have the apple or I can have the cake. The point is, the apple or the cake are not the only choices possible. And what the state calls choice is the choices, all of which suit the state, which you're then given the choice to choose between. So, encouraging choice. But that's saying if people make other choices, then they could be dangerous and going through radicalization. I know there'll be people looking at this and saying, yeah, you've got to stop ISIS. This is not about that. This is not about that. It's about freedom as a whole and having different views and the right to have them as a whole. Children are encouraged to know, understand and exercise their rights and personal freedoms. Well, clearly they're not, because there's rules galore. And you can't have an opinion outside the norm or you're being radicalized. Children are given the freedom to make choices and make decisions, so long as they suit the school and so long as they suit the state. Our school says we are actively challenging children, staff or parents expressing opinions contrary to fundamental British values, including those expressing extremist laws or extremist views. So, hold on. They, at this school, are actively challenging children, staff or parents who express opinions contrary to fundamental British values, which the state has decided what British values is and doesn't follow any of them when it's voting for war, voting to change policy that create massive austerity and suffering among people in their own country, that sell arms to Saudi Arabia by the billions of pounds at a time to suppress people in Saudi Arabia and to drop them on places like Yemen. These are British values. It's such bullshit. It's such hypocrisy. And in terms of the schools who are teaching our children, it's such naivety, ignorance, and acquiescence to the state. I wrote a book in 2003 called Tales from the Time Loop, which set out the scam, the manipulation, and the sequence that led to the lie and lies that produced the manufactured excuse to invade Iraq. And what's coming to light bit by bit is confirming that sequence. First of all, we've had a memo come into the public arena written by Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State in the US in the run-up and during the invasion of Iraq. And they call him Colin, but his name's spelled Colin. I can only surmise that they call him Colin because he's full of shit, because that is what came to be obvious when he was doing a presentation to the United Nations in the run-up to the Iraq invasion, selling the blatant lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction which he was going to unleash on the world. And this memo confirmed, and it was written in late March 2002, it confirmed that Tony Blair, British Prime Minister, was on board and supporting the American plans for the invasion of Iraq. That is late March 2002. And right up to the invasion in the spring of 2003, Tony Blair was still lying through his bloody teeth to the British Parliament and the British people, saying that even at this late stage in the run-up to the invasion, it could still be avoided if Saddam gave up his weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist. So we'll look at what he said, Mr. Liar, and genetically so. This is a speech or a statement to the House of Commons on February the 25th, 2003, very close to the invasion. And he said, "I detest his, Saddam's, regime. But even now, he, Saddam, can save it by complying with the UN's demand. Even now, we are prepared to go the extra step to achieve disarmament peacefully. I do not want war." Breathe, Dave, breathe. "But disarmament peacefully can only happen with Saddam's active cooperation." The truth? They knew those weapons of mass destruction didn't exist, but they needed an excuse to go to war as part of picking off regime after regime and country after country in the Middle East, which has gone on ever since. Something else that we now know is covered in this story: burn it, destroy it. And this is the fact that in the run-up to the Iraq invasion, Tony Blair's Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, said that the invasion was likely to be challenged under international law as illegal, which would make the people taking part war criminals. And when that advice was presented, someone in the Blair government circle, according to this story, ordered that that advice be burned and destroyed so no one saw it. And what then happened is that the pressure was applied mercilessly, probably, upon this Lord Goldsmith bloke to change his advice. And he did, and actually gave the advice that the invasion was actually legal. And all this manipulation is going on for reasons I'll come to in a second, because Iraq was simply one country in a list of countries being targeted for regime change by this global cabal that I've been exposing for a quarter of a century. And they needed excuses to do it. So weapons of mass destruction, even though it was a lie, was the excuse they chose. So this burn it story, this is what the story says. The burning row relates to the 13-page legal opinion presented by Lord Goldsmith to Blair on March the 7th, 2003, less than 3 weeks before the outbreak of war. The opinion, details of which were exclusively revealed by the Mail on Sunday in 2005, stated that the war was likely to be challenged under international law because of the lack of backing from the United Nations. The advice was never released and was kept secret from most of the cabinet because, governments are completely compartmentalized. Most of the people in the cabinet of a government don't have a clue what's bloody going on. Only a few powerful aides of Blair, such as Number 10 Director of Communications Alistair Campbell, were allowed to see it. A senior Number 10 figure at the time told the Mail on Sunday last night there was pandemonium. The date when war was expected to start was already in the diary. Well, it had been for bloody years, if not to the day. And here was Goldsmith saying it could be challenged under international law. They said, burn it, destroy it, and got to work on the Attorney General. Yeah, to change his bloody mind and give them the advice they wanted. Lord Goldsmith's one-page legal opinion, produced 10 days later, and 3 days before war broke out, stripped out all his previous reservations and declared the war to be legal. This version was discussed in Cabinet and cited in Parliament to justify military invasion. So, how do the pieces fit? Well, a series of countries that this global cabal working through Britain and the United States, that they wanted to overthrow and regime change and take over, goes back years. And Iraq was just one of them. And the first public sight of this list came in September 2000 when an organization called the Project for the New American Century, neoconservatives or neocons as they were called, produced this document listing a series of countries for regime change, and regime change as a result of what they called multiple theater wars fought by the United States, either covertly or overtly through the Arab Spring. And these countries included Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, and they needed excuses to invade them, to regime change them. The people involved with the project for the new American century included Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, who then became Defense Secretary and Deputy Defense Secretary running the Pentagon, few months later when the Bush administration came to light. Another person involved with the project for the new American century was Dick Cheney, who a few months later became Vice President of the United States and, in truth, President, in fact, while Boy George Bush was reading his bloody comics or something. The document also said that this process of transformation, that he called it, this series of country takeovers, would be necessarily slow, absent some catalyzing and catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor. These characters came to power in the Bush administration a few months later, and soon after that, in the same year, in fact 1 year to the same month that this document was published, the United States had 9/11. And Bush called it our Pearl Harbor. As a result of that terrorist attack, which was an inside job, that's why none of the pieces make any bloody sense and none of the official story makes any sense. As a result of 9/11, they had the excuse to start the war on terror. And the war on terror led eventually to the excuse to invade Iraq. And because they didn't have an excuse, they made one up. Weapons of mass destruction. It's the sequence that, or the technique that I call problem, reaction, solution. You create a problem covertly, you tell the people that they're in danger because of the problem and you want a reaction from the people, do something. And so after you've created the problem, got the reaction, do something, you then offer the solutions to the problems you created, which is to do what you intended to do all along, but couldn't do or justify without the manufactured problem. Now there's another version of that that I call no problem, reaction, solution. You don't need a real problem, you just need to invent one and get the public perception that there's a problem, i.e. weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And so the invasion of Iraq was always going to happen, and all the bullshit about, oh no, it could still be stopped, was all lies. And so when Lord Goldsmith came along and said, actually this could be illegal, of course, burn it, destroy it, because it was a danger to the plan of invading Iraq. Then there's another thing. Dr. David Kelly. David Kelly was a weapons inspector with great experience of Iraq. And he knew that what Blair and his spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, in cohorts with British intelligence were telling the British people about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was simply not true. And these people produced a dossier, oh, say, be very afraid. Oh, we better invade then, yeah, Blair, be afraid. And what happened is that David Kelly, who no one really had ever heard of, in the public arena anyway, talked to a BBC journalist called Andrew Gilligan and told him that this dossier had been sexed up. In other words, it was full of bloody lies to justify the war. Now this was very, very dangerous to the credibility of the invasion. I mean, here was a weapons inspector of enormous experience in Iraq saying actually they're lying in effect. And what then happened was that he was outed, was subject to enormous public attention, outed as the person who was behind Gilligan's source for the dossier being sexed up. And soon afterwards, he left home and went for a walk from which he never returned, because he went into the woods and committed suicide. And the official story of his suicide is so ludicrous, so ridiculous, so incredible, it takes the breath away. What I'm going to do in this video cast is go through the detail of these different elements. But for this, opening, if you like, I'm going to just connect the dots of how the background went on. So, as I'll talk about in detail, Kelly was murdered by the state. So then they had an inquiry into what happened to David Kelly, which was instigated by Blair and his former bloody housemate, flatmate, Lord Falconer, the top law officer of the time, the Lord Chancellor. And they appointed this guy, Lord Hutton, a real establishment bloke, to oversee the inquiry into what happened to David Kelly, who died so, shall we say, conveniently for the agenda. And the Hutton inquiry, I can only repeat, was so ludicrous, so ridiculous, so incredible, in the sense that its outcome was clearly decided before any evidence was given. This is why Lord Hutton has been known to this day as Lord Whitewash. The Dunblane story, the Dunblane horror, has been followed by the most monumental cover-up, which relates to protecting paedophile rings involving the rich and famous, politicians, police, the judiciary, just as is the case with the VIP paedophile scandals in Westminster. These are all connected, and the scale, even with all the revelations that have come out, the scale of these VIP rings, which in the end, if you go deep enough, are one ring basically, is absolutely extraordinary in its scale. So let's look first of all at the Express story and how far it went. It's headed Top Military School Abuse Probed. Police Scotland has been ordered to carry out a full investigation into claims that officers covered up allegations of a VIP paedophile ring at a top military school. How many times have we heard this recurring theme? Simple reason why. When you are running paedophile rings involving politicians and the judiciary and top police people, then you have, by definition, the very people and the very establishment necessary to cover it up and not investigate it. It's real simple when you know how it works. The story goes on. Officers allegedly covered up claims of a VIP paedophile ring at the Queen Victoria's School in Dunblane. Glenn Harrison was a housemaster at Queen Victoria's School when he became concerned about a group of powerful individuals having access to his pupils. He made a report to the Old Central Scotland Police, but officers responded by breaking down the door of his flat and removing computer disks, papers and other evidence. Another recurring theme of what happens to people trying to expose the truth of these paedophile rings. And let no one be in any doubt the Dunblane killings and Thomas Hamilton were fundamentally connected to paedophile rings. Mr. Harrison was then escorted from the school, which has Prince Philip as its patron, more of that shortly, and questioned by detectives in a local police station. After the disturbing incident in December 1991, he moved to the Shetland Islands and continued his successful career as a school teacher. Mr. Harrison never received an explanation for the way he was treated, but the explanation I've just given. People exposing these rings are hardly popular with those protecting these rings. This Queen Victoria School is the same school connected to Thomas Hamilton, the Dunblane killer, who was seen walking around the school dormitories at night. And Glenn Harrison goes on, as I'll go into detail later, about famous people turning up in fancy cars at the school and taking away boys who came back distressed. Thomas Hamilton was a Jimmy Savile figure. Not on the same scale, but he did the same things. Not only was a paedophile himself, which came out and was covered up at the subsequent Dunblane inquiry, but he procured children for the rich and famous. And thus he was afforded the same protection by the establishment as was Jimmy Savile, who for decades and decades and decades did the same on a gargantuan scale. And when I go through this Dunblane story and its connection to the paedophile VIP rings, people might appreciate why we have seen in recent weeks the blatant, the pathetic, the disgusting efforts of parts of the British media and certainly the establishment. The campaign effort to trash the claims of the VIP paedophile rings in Westminster, involving former Prime Minister Ted Heath, former Home Secretary Leon Britton, and others. What happened after the horrors of Dunblane was that an inquiry was set up, headed by a guy called Lord Hutton, senior Scottish judge, who was wheeled out to oversee a number of government inquiries. And it is my view, and the view of many others, having looked at what happened, that the Dunblane inquiry was the most blatant, outrageous cover-up of so much of the background to Thomas Hamilton and what was behind and who was behind and who was connected to the Dunblane tragedy. When we have a situation where Lord Cullen orders that evidence that was seen by the inquiry had to be sealed from public view for 100 years, you know, if there's a brain cell on active duty, that there's something going on here, and it's not very nice. We had a situation where evidence of the paedophile activities of Thomas Hamilton were dismissed, where people like the housemaster at the Queen Victoria School, Glenn Harrison, wasn't called to be a witness. Fundamental evidence he had to give, as I'll come to as we go through this. How other people who had crucial things to say were not called by the inquiry. And how the efforts to cover up what happened were orchestrated by the Freemasonic and secret society networks of Scotland, and probably further afield as well. And it's worth noting that for historical and other reasons, Scotland is a major global centre of secret society activity. They don't call it the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry for no reason. This gives more credence to the evidence of a man called Lord Burton, who was a Grand Master, former Grand Master, of Scottish Freemasonry. And in the wake of Dunblane and the Cullen inquiry, he spoke to a British Sunday newspaper, the News of the World, and said that the Cullen inquiry had been a cover-up. Not too much study would confirm the validity of that. He talked about there was something sinister about the Dunblane affair, and so there was. And what he talked about was a elite group within Scottish Freemasonry that he called the Speculative Society. And he said that the Speculative Society was fundamentally involved in the Dunblane cover-up. And the Dunblane, Speculative Society is apparently based at Edinburgh University, and its patron is Prince Philip, the patron of the Queen Victoria School. And a senior member of the Speculative Society is Lord Cullen, who, at least in one report I read, also had connections with the Queen Victoria School. Burton said that when he started asking questions about Dunblane, he was threatened with consequences if he didn't shut up. And that is what happens to people who speak out and try to expose the truth, or at least ask questions that the establishment doesn't want people to consider. So what we have with Dunblane, and I'll go into the detail as we go along, is the paedophile ring that is global in its entirety. We're seeing that show its head. So with the Westminster scandal, there was that global paedophile ring coming to the surface in terms of Westminster, and what Dunblane was, the background to Dunblane was that global paedophile ring coming to the surface and then being suppressed with regard to Scotland. And what's interesting to me is that the royal family, the members of the royal family, come up again and again with regard to this. Not only do we have Prince Philip, a patron of the Queen Victoria School and a patron of the Speculative Society, we of course have Prince Charles and Prince Philip as friends for decades of Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile was brought into the inner royal circle, this aging disc jockey who turned out to be, in terms of the public arena, a record-breaking paedophile who the police knew about but did nothing about, see Thomas Hamilton. But actually, what the media is not saying is that Savile was a procurer of children for the rich and very, very famous. And that's why his back was watched, just as, until Dunblane, so was Thomas Hamilton's. And Savile was brought into that inner circle by Lord Mountbatten, a known paedophile, who Savile himself said introduced him to the royal inner sanctum. And for decades and decades and decades and decades, Savile was a close friend of people like Prince Charles. And while that was going on, the police knew about Savile. The intelligence services, who are so protective of the royal family, you can't cough out of place without they know about it if you're close to them. They didn't know about Savile? Of course they did. So why? Why, when the intelligence services knew about Savile and the police knew about Savile, was he allowed for decades into the inner sanctum of the royal family? And why, in the same period, or part of that period, was he a very close friend of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher? The reason is the same as with Thomas Hamilton. The paedophile rings, like I say, in the end, ring, infiltrate and infest the entire establishment, worldwide, basically. And what we've seen in Britain is the tip of the tip of the tip of the tip, and I could go on for 20 minutes saying tip of the iceberg of what there is to know about paedophilia and the global establishment. So what I'm going to do today is go through Dunblane, because from that comes an understanding of how the whole thing works, because this Dunblane is a small part, horrific, but small part of a vast, vast whole, a vast network. And we must not let the malevolence of the British media, or parts of it, and the genetic malevolence of the establishment trash claims of these paedophile rings so that the public goes away and forgets about them. Could be your children tomorrow. And as I'm speaking, it will be someone's child, someone's children.